Hello and welcome to BattleTech Faction Briefings. Today, we are looking at a mercenary force that has most often been associated with the Federated Sons. They were originally an SLDF unit. They were disgraced in the Fourth Succession War, and they would have a nearly unmatched string of bad luck. Today, we are talking about the Screaming Eagle Mercenaries. The emblem of the Screaming Eagles is a diving eagle on a blue-green background. It is simple and effective, as it represents their name perfectly. The different regiments do not have their own individual emblems, unlike many other mercenaries. The Screaming Eagles use their original SLDF color scheme of olive green drab. It is a very basic military color, and it won't stand out very much on the tabletop. However, it will stand out against many of the brighter units in the BattleTech universe. The Screaming Eagles tend to be on garrison duty, but they do have a few key moments in their history. To skip spoilers, go to the time listed. The story of the Screaming Eagles dates back to the Star League, as they began as part of the SLDF. They would be formed prior to 2764 as the 250th Battle Mech Division of the 58th Corps' 7th Army. They would be stationed in District 3 of the Capellan Confederation as trouble started in the periphery. In 2765, the 58th Corps were sent to the periphery in order to fight in the Second Periphery Rebellion that was sparked by the New Vandenberg Uprising. When the Ameris Civil War erupted in December 2766, the 250th Battle Mech Division would join up with Kerensky's forces during the Hegemony campaign. After the war, the 250th were divided on whether to join Operation Exodus or stay and protect the Inner Sphere. A part of the division would go, but a fair chunk of them would stay. The 555th Honor Guard Brigade and 556th Honor Guard Brigade would remain in the Inner Sphere and join together with the 77th Heavy Armor Brigade to become the Screaming Eagle Mercenaries. Their first contract was of House Davian, as they believed the Davians to be the most honorable of the 5 houses. Interestingly, some of their 250th Battle Mech Division brothers would join up with the AFFS as part of the 3rd SETI Hussars. Prior to the war, the mercenaries would be made up of 5 regiments. The Bald Eagle Regiment was stationed on Tawas. The Golden Eagles were stationed on Edwards. The Storm Eagles were on Waycross. The Night Eagles were on Logandale. And the Snow Eagles were on Godric. In 2787, the Draconis Combine began an invasion of the Federated Sons. The worlds of Waycross and Edwards would be taken, and the Storm Eagles and Golden Eagles would have to flee. This attack would be followed up by taking Logandale in 2792 and Godric in 2796. Causing the retreat of the Night Eagles and Snow Eagles. Then, in 2795, the Capellan Confederation began a campaign to capture Chesterton. The plan was to capture the worlds around the target world to cut that world off from any kind of support. The world of Tawas would be captured by the 15th Drakon, another former SLDF unit, driving off the Bald Eagles in 2797. The Federated Sons were finally able to counterattack the Capellans in 2810. The campaign would push the Capellans off of several captured worlds. Once the 3rd and 5th Crucius Lancers retook Teddy Bear, the Bald Eagles and Gold Eagles would hold it as the garrison force. Then, in 2814, Robinson would be liberated from the Draconis Combine, and the remainder of the Screaming Eagle mercenaries would be stationed on Robinson as a garrison. The First Succession War was rough on the Eagles, as they lost a good portion of their brigade in the fighting. The Bald Eagles were down to 30% effective strength and were stationed on Teddy Bear alongside the Golden Eagles, who were down to 38% effective. The Storm Eagles were down to 33% while stationed on Robinson alongside the Night Eagles regiment, which was down to 45% effective, and the Snow Eagles at 34% effective. Despite their SLDF training, they could not withstand the might of the great houses. The solution to rebuild their forces was to combine the remains of their regiments into 2 full-strength regiments. Prior to the start of the war, the 1st Regiment would be stationed on Demeter, while the 2nd would remain on Teddy Bear. The Screaming Eagles would receive orders to move to the Outworlds Alliance border. They would be replacing the 39th Avalon Hussars, who were moving over to the Capellan border. However, these plans would be thrown out as the CCAF launched another campaign to capture Chesterton. The Screaming Eagles teamed up with the 39th as relief forces for the 4th Syrtis Fusiliers on Demeter. They would arrive in system on June 30th, 2828. However, the death of Capellan Chancellor Ilsa Liao would cause the Capellan commander to pull off world, ending the campaign. The 4th Syrtis Fusiliers would survive without any backup, and their commander, Colonel Damien Hasek, would be awarded the status of Duke of New Syrtis. The Screaming Eagles would play border defense against the Capellans and the Combine over the course of the war. By the end of the war, the 2 regiments of the Screaming Eagles would be stationed on Elbar. The 1st Regiment would be down to 17%, and the 2nd Regiment would be down to 70% effectiveness. The 3rd Succession War allowed the Screaming Eagles to rebuild, as they were able to become 2 full regiments with aerofighter, armor, and infantry support. They would be set as border defense. By 3025, the Screaming Eagles would be stationed on Skeptana. They would remain as its garrison until the 4th Succession War broke out. The Screaming Eagles would continue their contract with the Federated Sons and would be part of Operation Rat as the 4th Succession War began. They would be sent to Polone in 3028. They would face the 3rd Battalion of McCrimmon's Light Cavalry. The Eagles began with airstrikes. The Light Cavalry would retreat to an old SLDF base in the mountains. This led to a 3-week siege until the Eagles were able to get a small force inside the fortress. By the end of the assault, there would only be 1 company of mechs left, and the Light Cavalry would surrender. 2 battalions would be left to garrison Polone, while the rest of the unit went to Gansing. They battled against the local Gansing militia. The Eagles got conventional backup from the AFFS to make up for their lack of troops. The battle ended quickly, and the 1st Screaming Eagles moved on to their next objective. Meanwhile, the 2nd Screaming Eagles Regiment would team up with the Crater Cobras, the 5th Syrtis Fusiliers, and 15 conventional regiments for an attack on Sarna. The Syrtis Fusiliers would break away from the group and rush to the world as they wanted to get vengeance for the assassination of Duke Michael Hasek Davian. They would arrive early and face intense air cover and then get wrecked by 4 regiments of McCarran's armored cavalry. To make things worse, many of the conventional regiments would also get destroyed due to a transport accident. The mercenaries wanted to pull away, but they knew they had to fulfill their contract. However, they chose to land further away from their planned LZ in order to have time to organize their forces against the greater numbers of their enemy. The new LZ would be in a heavily forested area. The mercenaries quickly took out the local defenders and made sure the remaining conventional forces would have a place to land. They would send out for reinforcements, but the communications interdiction by Comstar would prevent the message from going out. To make matters worse, the jump ships would leave, as they were under the impression everything was going according to plan. This led to a guerrilla campaign in order to fight against the greater numbers of Sarna's planetary garrison. By December, the mercenary forces would get surrounded by 4 enemy regiments. However, the arrival of the Davian Guards would shift the battle to favor the AFFS. The regiments of McCarran's armored cavalry would attempt to escape rather than risk their forces against fresh soldiers. The Eagles and Cobras would chase down their fleeing enemies in order to avenge the 5th Syrtis Fusiliers. They would harass Big Mac as they made their way to their dropships. However, the commander planned a counterattack. The 2nd McCarran's armored cavalry would ambush the mercenaries as the rest of their forces got on the dropships. The fight was so intense that the 2nd would lose half their forces. After the armored cavalry fled, the Screaming Eagles were down to 1/4 full strength, and the Crater Cobras were down to 1/3 full strength. The efforts of the mercenaries would cost McCarran's armored cavalry over a regiment of equipment and soldiers over the course of this long battle. The Screaming Eagle regiments were united for their next objective, New Canton. They would bring along 5 regiments of infantry from the Almach garrison as support. They would face the 1st Battalion of the 4th Confederation Reserve Cavalry and the 3rd Battalion of Trimaldi's Secutors. The 1st Screaming Eagles would chase the 4th into the jungle with no results. The 4th would use hit-and-run attacks that frustrated the Eagles. It took time, but they would trap the 4th against a river, and the enemy battalion would surrender. Then, Colonel Mathis, enraged and frustrated at this battle, would seal the surrendering soldiers in their cockpits and have their mechs pushed into the deep river. The Fed Sun's infantry commander, Colonel Gathos, would demand Colonel Mathis surrender himself. After a tense standoff, several Eagles would turn to the side of the infantry commander, and Mathis would surrender and be arrested for his war crimes. The 2nd Eagles were sent to attack Trimaldi's Secutors. This would lead into a chase through the mountains. Infantry forces were airlifted to block a narrow pass, and the Eagles planned a pincer attack to finish off the Secutors. However, the Eagle mechs were delayed by local conventional forces. This delay lasted for 6 days. By the time the 2nd Eagles arrived, 2/3 of the Davian infantry forces were dead. They would take New Canton, but their methodology would upset Fed Sun's military command. After the Battle of New Canton, the 1st would be ordered to attack the world of Men-Kalinan. However, they initially refused due to the AFFS not giving them a resupply as punishment for their behavior on New Canton. After long negotiations, the Eagles agreed to continue their contract, but many Eagles were considering abandoning the contract or leaving the unit. The world of Men-Kalinan would be contested by both the Free Worlds League and the Capellan Confederation. Thus, the Eagles had to fight the sizable local militia and the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Free Worlds Guards. When they landed, they would catch the Free Worlds Guards off guard and cause them to retreat. They took on the militia, but the commander of the guards was given orders to support the Capellans. The Eagles' 1st and 2nd Battalions were sent to fight the guards, but their rear lines would get wrecked by the time they arrived, causing issues with supplies and communications. The Eagles retreated, but used the mistrust between the Capellans and the Leaguers to plan a counterattack. Their efforts paid off, and the guards would flee the world, while the local militia would eventually collapse. After the war came to an end, the Screaming Eagles were put on trial. They would be found not guilty of misconduct, but the events on New Canton would stain their reputation for decades. The contract with the Federated Sons would continue, and Colonel Mathis would be removed from his command and imprisoned. The Screaming Eagles would start to rebuild slowly after their disgrace. The 1st would be stationed on Mararn, and the 2nd would be stationed on Sadr Talja. When the war started, both units would be transferred to Glenmora. The 2nd would remain as a defense unit, while the 1st would go to the front lines. The 1st Screaming Eagles would be teamed up with the 1st Seti Hussars for the invasion of Eladari in April 3039. The Eagles' jump ship would go to the wrong coordinates, and the Hussars thought the Eagles died in transit. The Eagles would finally arrive as the Hussars finished the conquest of the world. The 1st Screaming Eagles would be commanded to garrison Eladari, while the Hussars went off to capture the world of Misery. However, 2 weeks later, unmarked jump ships would arrive in system. The Screaming Eagles strengthened their defense in preparation for a combined counterattack. The enemies arrived on August 5th. They used Star League-era mechs, painted in white. The Eagles moved forward with their plan to use a smokescreen to give the defenders an advantage. The white mechs were unaffected as they had weapons with longer ranges and superior targeting systems. The white mechs would use precision attacks to shoot down missiles of both ballistic and smoke bomb variety, causing the Eagles' tactics to fall apart completely. Within half an hour, half the Eagle forces were destroyed. They surrendered and were allowed to recover their pilots, but any attempt to gather salvage was stopped with force. After their retreat, they would learn that their enemies had been the 9th and 10th Ghost Regiments. Meanwhile, the 2nd Screaming Eagles and 1st Seti Hussars arrived at Misery shortly after the Ryukin Roku had jumped out for an assault on a different world. However, they would get new orders and return to Glenmora rather than continue the war. The 2nd would reach their destination and eventually meet up with the retreating 1st, who also fled to Glenmora. By the end of the war, the 1st Regiment was stationed on Mararn. and the second would be on Sodertage, the same posts they had been on before the war began. They would mostly defend the world from minor pirate raids. The Eagles struggled to rebuild before the clan invasion due to earning no new accolades from this war. The Screaming Eagles would maintain their station on Mararn and Sotertalja as the invasion began. However, the Federated Commonwealth would not continue their contract. This led the Screaming Eagles to try to find a new contractor. By 3053, they would find themselves working in the Magistracy of Canopus. They would play a defensive role for years, with their battalions being stationed on Booker, Bass, Bethonolog, Gambalon, Paladix, and Techne's Revenge. They would mostly have a peaceful time during this era outside of stopping occasional pirate raids. However, the events of Operation Guerrero would change the status quo. The creation of the Chaos March would lead to major territory grabs by several of the major powers. Due to the Trinity Alliance, the Screaming Eagles were loaned to the Capellan Confederation during this time. In 3059, the Eagles would be stationed on Kaifeng, protecting the world as it would be shifted from the Sarna Supremacy to the Capellan Confederation. They would continue working in the Chaos March, taking whatever work came their way. In 3062, they would be on Epsilon Iridani, and the 2nd Screaming Eagles would get ambushed by the 1st Division of the Word of Blake. The 2nd would be nearly destroyed and would rush back to Kaifeng, but be refused landing privileges. Learning of this, the 1st would go AWOL and meet up with their brother unit on Outreach. Things would get worse for the Eagles, as the Word of Blake revealed that the 2nd Regiment had a secret contract with House Davian to act as spies as of 3055. This again left the Eagles with no contract. However, House Davian would give them a second chance as tensions grew in the Federated Commonwealth. They would not have the resources to rebuild. Thus, the Eagles divided their forces into a reinforced regiment along with a reinforced combined arms regiment, mostly made up of armor and infantry. They would be working directly for Duke James Sandoval of the Draconis March. He would send them to Kilbourne on the border with the Outworlds Alliance as a means of keeping them out of his way and freeing up his forces for an attack on the Draconis Combine. The Screaming Eagles would again be fighting minor pirate raids with no possibility of earning back their reputation. However, in 3071, they would get the chance to prove themselves when they were ordered to attack the world of Remora in the Outworlds Alliance. The mission was a preemptive strike, and the Eagles would leave some of their armor forces behind as a garrison. They expected to find the Word of Blake, but instead came across Clan Snowraven, the Outworlds Alliance borderers, and a trinary of the 6th Raven battle cluster would confront the Screaming Eagles. The Eagles would win the battle, but it would cost them half their forces, including their lead tactician. They would gather the salvage and return to their garrison just in time to find it under attack by the remainder of the 6th Raven battle cluster. The Screaming Eagle armor forces were able to hold back the Snow Ravens, and with help from the newly arrived mech forces, the 6th Raven battle cluster would be destroyed. After the fighting, the Eagles would learn that their order to attack Remora was fake, and the whole thing had been a trap that thankfully failed. However, the responsible party remained unknown. The Screaming Eagles would be transferred to Kentwood by 3079 as part of their continued defense against the Outworlds Alliance. As they would be down to 2/3 of their full strength, the Eagles would make changes to their unit. During this period, they would expand the amount of battle armor they used to balance out the lack of mechs, and they would expand their armor forces while developing new tactics for this oddly formed regiment. In 3085, they would be stationed on Hyalite while working for the Federated Sons. Over the years, they would slowly decline to less than a regiment of soldiers. Part of this was due to the weak reputation of the unit, and part of this was due to the lack of funding caused by only getting very basic garrison work. As the era came to an end, they would be doing garrison work on Buena for the Lyran Commonwealth, a simple assignment as the rebellion on that world had been crushed years prior. Their luck would turn around in 3152 when they were approached by a representative of Clan Seafox. She would help them get a contract with Starcore's Industries. They would be the guards for a BattleTech factory on Sanhoa, an independent world. They were brought in to fight off McGee's cutthroats, who had been pulling raids in that region of space. They would defeat the cutthroats and take a good amount of salvage. This would lead the Eagles into getting new recruits locally, as well as former members of the cutthroats who were looking for a better mercenary unit. This would help the Screaming Eagles become a full regiment for the first time in decades. Currently, the Screaming Eagles are pirate hunting in the territory around Sanhoa as they continue their contract with Starcore Industries. Their contacts with Clan Seafox are also helping the unit improve in terms of firepower. They have a bright future ahead, even if they are corporate lackeys, rather than being honorable descendants of the SLDF. Oh, how the mighty have fallen, from an SLDF brigade to barely a regiment. They never had much in terms of prestige, and when they had opportunities, they usually messed them up due to bad luck or bad strategy. Somehow, they survived for centuries, but even in the Ill Clan era, they are still hunting pirates as they did back in the 31st century. They see it as redemption, but it doesn't seem very different from their previous line of work. Despite multiple eras of decline, the Screaming Eagles still have some notable pilots. Samuel Castile, a general in the SLDF and commander of the 250th BattleTech Division. He would use any means necessary to expand his forces, including political maneuvering and the company store method of absorbing struggling mercenary forces. His fate after the Americivil War is unclear, but it is likely he stayed in the Inner Sphere as Castile is not a blood name. Bother Hokala. He served double duty as both the commander of the Screaming Eagles in the late Third Succession War and also the XO of the Broken Wheel combat region of the Crucis March. He would lead the Eagles during the Fourth Succession War and would fight against Trimaldi's Secutors on New Canton. He would keep his unit together as best he could as morale dropped and would retire after his disgrace at the hands of the 9th and 10th Ghost Regiments in the War of 39. Opson Mathis. He was the commander of the 1st Screaming Eagles during the Fourth Succession War. He would end up sending the surrendering soldiers of the 1st Battalion of the 4th Confederation Reserve Cavalry to a watery grave. He would surrender and later be imprisoned for his crimes. Cindy Sin Johansson, the XO of the 2nd after the War of 39. She was a skilled pilot that was known for good accuracy and fast maneuvering. She was lighthearted when off duty, but held the respect of her troops. She would have issues with command, preventing her from getting promoted and making her consider leaving the unit. Strangely, she used a rare 3C variant of the Cicada and would get an experimental variant in the early clan invasion era. She pilots a CDA 3F Cicada. Tam Lafayette, a legacy officer of the Screaming Eagles, who took command by 3061. She would end up being tricked into raiding the Outworlds Alliance in 3071. She was able to defeat a Clan Snow Raven cluster, but the loss of her XO, Chris Lewis, her main tactician, would ensure the Eagles could not capitalize on this achievement and would continue their decline. Zane Hokala, a legacy of the Screaming Eagles, who was in command in the later part of the Dark Age into the Ill Clan era. He wanted to revive the unit's status after decades of decline. He would work with Clan Seafox agents to get a new job as the defenders of Sanhoa, where they would become pirate hunters once again. Beginning as part of the SLDF, the Screaming Eagles began with top-of-the-line equipment. However, like the Great Houses, their technology would decline over the centuries. By the Third Succession War, they would be in poor financial standing, which would prevent them from getting higher quality equipment. However, on occasion, they would get better gear either by salvage or as rewards from House Davian. Thus, most of their mechs will be from the Federated Sons, with occasional Capellan and even less occasional Combine salvage. In the later eras, they would also get some clan tech. In their early days, each regiment was a different weight class, but by the Third Succession War, both units would end up being medium weight regiments. The first has a heavy command lance and 1 lance of light mechs per company, with the rest of their forces in the medium weight bracket. Each battalion of the second had a specialty. The first was night battle, the second is infiltration and scouting, and the third is long range. They would only have 1 lance of heavy mechs per battalion, with assorted medium and light mechs to make up the rest of their companies. The Screaming Eagles tend to have good conventional backup forces. The Diving Eagles are their heavy fighter regiment, which later get Arrow 4 targeting systems. The 77th Heavy Armor originates from the SLDF and is made up of heavy and assault class tanks that are trained to take advantage of any opening caused by the fighters or the mechs. Finally, the Nested Eagles are the infantry unit, which is mostly stationed as base defense, but later would be trained for urban combat. They use jump infantry and later battle armor to support the rest of the Eagles on the battlefield when necessary. The tactics of the Screaming Eagles would change over the years as their unit shrank. They are best known for combined arms tactics and relying on damage caused by their heavy arrow fighters. It is noted that they lack their own dropships, but do have their own jump ship. The jump ship is likely a relic from when they served as part of the SLDF. They lack the polish of other former SLDF units that became mercenaries, but they use what they have to good effect, on occasion, every now and then. There is one piece of fiction I could find for the Screaming Eagles, but they are only a minor part of the story. Of note, A Skulk of Foxes has a very unsatisfying ending, so just be ready for that if you read it. Beyond that, they have quite a bit of history in various source books, but like always, some of those source books only have location and composition data. I have said it before and I will say it again. I enjoy discussing lesser-known mercenaries, even if their story falls into the category of they garrisoned a world and defended it from small raids, mostly because I feel smaller units deserve their due in the world of BattleTech. That being said, I have zero love for the Screaming Eagles. I can't even feel sorry for them, as they've made so many stupid choices and show a great deal of incompetence. There are lovable losers in BattleTech, but the Screaming Eagles are not one of them. They're just too stupid to live. No, I do not suggest painting up a set of Screaming Eagles. However, if you want some 58th Corps mechs in olive drab, go for it. I do support building SLDF units for the tabletop. If you did paint up the Screaming Eagles or the SLDF forces, let me know in the comments. Next time, I will be looking at units from the Draconis Combine, starting with the 5th Ghost, just in time for October. If you have suggestions, let me know in the comments. A big thank you to everyone who has been watching my channel. Fun fact, my channel recently turned 5, and I've been doing the BattleTech faction briefing videos for a little over half that time. And the only reason I continue is because of the support I get from my viewers. May your weapons stay hot and your reactors stay cool. I have over 50 videos in the BattleTech Faction Briefings playlist. Please check them out and let me know what other units I should cover in the future. Until next time, remember, I'll see you at the tavern.